Hey guys, just kind of taking it easy, hanging out by a campfire. Got some nice weather down here finally. Thought I'd put together a video discussion for you about the physical properties of fire, how it actually works, different uses for it, different tools you can create with it, and how you can utilize it. Now, if you recall your history lessons, you'll remember that fire was invented about 1576 by John Doe, completely by accident. All right, just kidding. But no, obviously fire's been around since the dawn of time. In some of its earliest forms, it was created by things like lightning and lava. Obviously, later man was able to utilize this and use it to his benefit and realize the many different importance that it had to offer. In order to have fire, three things must be present: fuel, a heat source, and oxygen. Without them, you cannot have fire. If you take one of those things away, fire will not work. If there's no oxygen to burn, you can't have fire. If there's no fuel, you can't have fire. If there's not a heat source to start the fire, it's not going to work. So if you take any one of those things away, you can't have fire. Now generally that is called the triangle of fire: oxygen, heat, and a fuel source. The creation of fire is actually a multi-part chemical reaction. Once you have your oxygen, your fuel, and your heat source, and you have the heat source applied to the fuel, it starts to break down the cellulose, in this case in the wood, and starts to release volatile gases, things like hydrogen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and that in turn mixes with the oxygen, which is an oxidizer, and creates things like steam and water vapor, and also mixes with the carbon, and those are actually the gases that actually light and catch on fire. From that, you get an emittance of photons and radiant heat, which is why we see it and feel the radiant heat coming off of it. This is known as the tetrahedron of fire. It encompasses the triangle of fire, again being heat, fuel, and oxygen, and in this case also includes the chemical chain reaction. This process can go one step further and include what's called the 3 T's of combustion, and that is time, temperature, and turbulence. You have to allow enough time for the temperature to get hot enough to be able to start to break down the cellulose, in this case in the wood, and then allow it enough turbulence of air to be moving around the object for it to be able to combust. And again, without any one of those three things, you can't have fire. You obviously have to have your heat source applied to it long enough so it catches fire, and enough oxygen, and so forth. So you can see how without any one of these things, fire won't work. Without oxygen, it won't work. Without a fuel source, it won't work. Without the proper chemical reaction and time allowed for that reaction, it won't work. So you can see how, in itself, it's very particular. For instance, when you're burning wood, or the incomplete combustion of different gases, it's incandescent solid particles, known as soot, that we see that give it the red-orange glow that we're usually used to. Now, this light has a continuous spectrum, and that's why we see it in the yellowish color that we do. When you get to a complete combustion of gases or fuel, that's when you start to see the more familiar blue look, like what you would see on like butane or propane or on your stove at home. It's a bright blue, wavelength, and it's one single wavelength. As we've all noticed, flames are pointed, and it does this for a couple of reasons. One is the Earth's gravity, and two, it also has to do with the way fire heats the surrounding area and changes the air pressure. It creates a low pressure, and it wants to equalize itself, so it rises up, and with that, with our gravity and the way Earth rotates, it wants to pull it upwards. So that's why you actually get the point to a flame. Now, in a zero gravity or anti-gravity situation, a flame actually turns into a sphere, and it has nothing reacting against it or trying to tell it what to do or make it pull in any certain direction, so it just glows in a little sphere. See if I can find a video of that to post, but it's really neat looking. Now, because of the way fire always acts and always wants to equalize with the surrounding air and rise, you can actually take advantage of that and exploit that in some ways. For instance, when you put up a windscreen around a fire, it's not obviously only blocking the wind and keeping the fire steady, but you're then also changing the temperature and the oxygen and the pressure around it, so it's going to want to rise more. So I suppose in some instances, if you needed to actually, if you needed a small fire with tall flames, you could create a windbreak all the way around it that would help it change the atmospheric pressure in its little area, therefore causing the flames to rise higher. So that could be something useful. Some of the most basic uses for fire are going to be things like keeping yourself warm, drying your clothes out, and being able to cook food. Along with being able to boil water, you can obviously sanitize things with it. Either you can place the object in boiling water to sanitize it, or for just something real quick, let's say if you wanted to sanitize your knife real quick to cut meat, you could place it in the flame just a little bit, just flame kissed, nothing much, just enough to kind of give it a good heating. But you don't want to actually get the blade hot because you don't want to change the temper of your blade or mess it up in any way. So this would just be something to real quick heat blast and be on your way about it. But that's a real good useful thing. Also, if you had to, say, sanitize your multi-tool to do surgery on someone or something like that, you know. So the reasons are endless for why you would need to sanitize something, but again, fire is very useful for that. Being able to create and maintain a proper fire structure can be very important. If you plan to have a fire all night long, as a general rule of thumb, you're going to end up needing about 5 times the amount of wood as what you think. So if you go out and collect a big old pile of firewood, chances are you're going to need about 5 times more than that. It's amazing how fast you can actually burn through wood. Also, it's very important the design and setup of your fire and being able to create, if necessary, a small, controlled, manageable fire. You know, you don't want something, for instance, as big as my fire burning all night. This is burning pretty good, and that means it's going to burn through wood pretty fast, especially because the stuff's really dry. You know, I have to keep feeding wood on it every 10-15 minutes. For a nighttime situation, you know, it's going to be hard to avoid adding wood to your fire, but if you can create something small that takes small pieces of wood but yet gives off a large amount of heat, well, then you still benefit from that, you know, especially if you've got a tarp or something else behind you to reflect the heat, or if you set up a windbreak or something like that. So being able to control the size and the heat output of your fire is very important. In other lessons, I'll actually go over building different types of fire and different structures and how they actually give off heat. As a small example, a little log-style cabin house. Well, log-style cabin fire, rather. You know, you stack it like you would a log cabin in a square fashion. Things like that actually give off a pretty large amount of heat, so those are good for warming an area, you know. So there are lots of things to be considered, and you always want to make sure to be able to control your fire properly. Smoke from a fire can actually be utilized in many different ways. For instance, it works great when you're creating a signal fire and you use thick white or dark smoke as a contrasting to the background. It can be used for tanning hides. It's really good for smoking meat and pretty much creating beef jerky. In conjunction with certain plants, it's really good as a mosquito and bug repellent, and it's also really good as an antibacterial agent for killing odor on your body. So let's take a look at some of those. So if you've been out in the woods for a couple of days and you're starting to get a little funky, you can actually use the smoke to give yourself a smoke bath odor and help hygiene. And that's another important factor is hygiene. You can also then go use the fire to dry out your feet and use the smoke to help kill any bacteria on your feet. Keeping your feet dry is one of the most important things. If your feet aren't dry, you start developing problems, possible fungus and other terrible things, start to get trench foot. You know, people in the Everglades after a couple of days were starting to have trouble with their feet and, you know, just couldn't get them dried out and just having a real rough time. So that's also an important thing is dry your feet out as much as possible. Give yourself a smoke bath. That'll help with hygiene. In addition to smoke being antibacterial, it can also be used as a really good hunting tool. For instance, you can use it to fire harden the tip of your spear or the tip of your frog gig to increase its strength. Or you could actually use the smoke from it to try and smoke an animal out from an underground hole. Place of fire, you know, find its entrance and exit holes if it has more than one. Some animals have multiple holes. You might have to block something off, but try and create a smoky fire in one of the holes, and it'll flush it out, and you can maybe set up a snare trap in the other hole or holes, or maybe try and club it on the way out. Also, you can utilize the smoke to subdue bees and try and gain access to a honeycomb in a real desperate situation or possibly just to avoid them. I need to do some research. I want to find out if smoke is also effective against wasps. I would think so, but knowing wasps might just piss them off more. Who knows? But so you can see that fire can be utilized in a couple different ways towards hunting applications. If you do end up securing a large meat source, you're obviously going to need a way to preserve that meat, and smoking it is a great way to do that. Now, in order to do that, you can cut it into real thin strips and hang it over a rack that's over a fairly decent medium to high heat with lots of smoke, so that the smoke pretty much cures it and dehydrates the meat. In the end, you're pretty much going to have beef jerky or jerky of some sort, or whatever animal you've made out of it. But once it's done that, you can pretty much store it and have it for, I've heard, upwards to a month, even longer. Again, it's pretty much just going to be straight up dehydrated meat. Now, the process takes a very long time. I did this both in 2 of Dave's classes, and it easily takes all night, if not longer. So you're talking 10, 12, 15 hours, which means you have to stay there and tend to fire for that long. Now, it can't be too hot to where you burn the meat, and it can't be too cold. It can't be too small. It can't be too big. So again, the balance is very important. Also, with that comes your wood supply. Again, as I mentioned before, you're going to have a heck of a lot of wood to sit there and burn it for 15 hours. So you have to make the appropriate adjustments beforehand so that you're not halfway through trying to scurry and find a ton of wood and have your fire go out and start the whole process over. So again, that furthers the point that it's important to have 4 or 5 times more firewood than you think you need for any occasion, because that'll just help out in the end. But, so you can see, smoke from a fire is very valuable for both hunting and then preserving the meat later. When creating a signal fire, there are a couple things to keep in mind. For instance, whenever possible, you want to be out in an open field or as high as elevated in an open area as can be, so it's as visible as possible. Also, I believe one of the international distress signal signs is 3 evenly spaced fires. That's because I believe, who's going to build 3 fires, so that's obvious to them, and they'll see that. Also, if you're in an area, for instance, when I was in the Florida Everglades, the ground was sopping wet there. It's, chest-high razor grass and ankle-deep water, so you have to actually build a raised platform for your fire. But the main things to keep in mind are also what kind of background you have and what colored sky you have, so that you can appropriately make either white smoke or black smoke if possible. You can use pretty much any vegetation that's still alive, and that'll give you thick, billowing white smoke, which will contrast really well against trees. Sometimes it doesn't contrast so well against the sky, though, so you have to possibly make adjustments for that. And if you can, use some sort of petroleum-based product to create black smoke. You could use, if you had to, you cut chunks of the sole of your shoe off or something, or a tire, plastic bottles, a pair of flip-flops. Pretty much anything man-made will burn black, so that'll give real good contrast to whatever you're trying to draw attention to. One of your biggest priorities in a survival situation, aside from keeping warm, is having clean, drinkable water. Now, I'm going to assume you all have your stainless steel water bottle with you to just plop into the fire and boil yourself some water. If you don't, you can use fire as a tool to create yourself a primitive vessel for boiling water. It's real easy. All you do is find yourself a stump or a log that's suitable to hold, let's say, 32 ounces of water. Pretty much all you do is take coals from your fire, put them on the log. It's usually best, I find, to do the log long ways and have it burn down to the center. And pretty much you let it burn, you scrape off a layer, you let it burn, you scrape off a layer, and it takes a very long time. I've done 2 of them at Dave Canterbury's classes, and they take the majority of the day, but in the end you're left with a container that you can use to boil water. So again, that's just one more way that fire can be used as a tool to create a vessel for yourself. Actually, you can even go back further with that, and if you have available clay source, you could actually fire yourself a clay pot. Build yourself a small kiln and set up your fire and have a nice coal bed and actually create a clay vessel for boiling water. So that's one thing I'm going to look into. Since we've got tons of river clay down here, it's almost perfect for that, so I'm going to give that a shot. Fire is also a really useful tool for reshaping and bending wood. if you've got a fresh sapling or something like that you want to bend into an appropriate shape, you could stick pegs in the ground and create yourself a jig, so to speak, and then bend the wood as needed, and as it dried out, it would stay in that shape. It's actually really useful if you're making like a self bow or something like that. I actually did it one time. I had one that it needed to be rebent and curved a little bit different. So, like I said, I stuck some pegs in the ground, made a jig, made sure it was nice and close to the fire, and that it was, when I did it, I actually let it soak in the bathtub for a long time. I did it at home, so that it got nice and damp. It was rather dry, so this way, it fully steams itself, and the steam will actually help reshape the wood. And that's the kind of process they use in manufacturing for all sorts of things. They steam the wood and put it in a heavy press. This way, you're just doing it with a set of pegs right next to the fire, so that works real well. Coals and ashes can also be utilized as valuable tools. For instance, you could easily use the coal as a drawing tool if you need to make measurements for something. It's really good as a makeshift water filter. It can even be used to help remove any toxins you've ingested. For instance, if someone goes to the hospital overdosed on something, they'll actually give them activated charcoal. They drink that, it absorbs the toxins in your stomach, and then you vomit, and it helps get rid of a lot of the toxins. So if you had to, that could be something useful if you ate something you shouldn't have. Another real good thing is that you can actually boil down the wood ash, mix it with tallow, boil down the wood ash to create lye, mix it with rendered tallow from animal fat, and then you can actually create soap from that. So you can actually use the byproducts of fire in a couple of different ways. One of fire's most valuable assets is actually keeping your morale up. It helps, it helps ward off the boogeyman, keeps animals away, helps keep bugs and mosquitoes down, and just, it helps give you peace of mind. It's a very useful thing in a stressful situation. It'll just calm, relax you. And again, we've seen all the different uses and needs for it. It's good to practice primitive methods in case, if you happen to lose all your gear. That in itself is a valuable thing to learn. But it's also a really good idea to make sure you've always got more than one way, in my opinion, 2, 3, even 3 or 4 ways to be able to create fire. Personally, I smoke cigarettes, so I've always got a cigarette lighter on me. I've always got a ferro rod on my knife. I've got a backup one on my EDC carabiner, and I've probably got 1 or 2 other lighters stashed away somewhere. So, my flint and steel kit also. So, yeah, I'm going to be able to make fire one way or the other. So that's an important thing. So it's one thing to be considered. Here's a cheap trick. Always keep something in your backpack that's kind of rigid and stiff, something you could fan the fire with. Sometimes I carry a kind of thick piece of cardboard that I could also use as tinder if I needed to in an emergency. But it makes a world of difference. It makes it so you don't have to huff and puff on a fire, get your face in a bunch of smoke. Being able to fan a fire is way, way easier. So that takes a lot of effort off of you. So here's a little quick fire safety tip. This is actually something I should have taken care of. If you can see this root right here, you actually have to kind of watch out for that. These can actually catch fire and burn underground. So that's something you really want to look into if you dig a fire pit or if you're in an area that has a lot of roots and vines and stuff like that, because you don't want to burn things down. Anytime you're in conditions where your wood might be slightly damp, it's always obviously a good idea to set it next to the fire to dry out some. Obviously you don't want it so close that it catches on fire, but it's also a good idea to kind of stack in a Lincoln log faction, or a log cabin. This way it gets really good airflow and heats thoroughly. So that's, always a real good idea. If you just had a pile of it set up next to it, it wouldn't be good. Also, I've got it stacked on 2 other logs. That way it's up off the ground, because if I had it, just on the dirt, that's going to be cold and, suck heat out of it, so you wouldn't want that. So it's a good idea to get it raised up off the ground some. and at an appropriate distance to be dried out. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully this wasn't too terribly boring watching a fire. Listen to me talk the whole time. But hopefully you got some good information out of it. I plan to bring you guys some better videos coming up. I've been rather limited as what I can do. I've been actually using my cell phone this whole time. So that's been put a damper on what I can do in the swamp, being near water and such. So I hope to be getting a new camera sometime soon, something waterproof. I've also just been wanting to kind of get these discussions out of the way just to lay a good groundwork on things before I actually start, doing primitive skills and different methods and advanced stuff and trapping and all that kind of thing. So anyway, I appreciate y'all watching. Have a good one.